I thank you for coming along and hitching a ride with me as we travel our way through the good ship of the Gospel of Matthew, his story of Jesus and his relevance and importance for us today and for every generation of person out there. Matthew chapter 21 and verses 24 to 25. I'm going to be reading out of this book, the Ford Translation New Testament, and it is my source for the Williams translation. Chapter 21 and verses 24 and 25. Jesus answered them, "Let me too ask you one question. If you answer it, I will tell you by what authority I have for doing as I do. Where did John's baptism come from? From heaven or from men?" They argued it out among themselves in this way. "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why did you not believe him?" Jesus, from my observation, can be pretty annoying to deal with. I mean, you ask this person a question, and what does he do? He responds with a question. Now, that can be pretty frustrating when you are trying to have a frank and honest discussion. Okay, let's be honest. The religious leaders were not interested in the frank and honest discussion. Not only does Jesus respond to people's question with a question, but it gets worse than that. Jesus, as it were, gets to the punchline before they can. Have you ever tried telling a joke to somebody and somebody butts into your joke time and they give the punchline? It can be very deflating. You see, people often ask Jesus with the intent to get his authority on their side. Jesus, by doing what he does, circumvents what they are trying to do. The religious leaders come to Jesus with their questions, and Jesus responds with his own question. If I ask you if you have stopped kicking the dog, what do you answer? Well, we know with these type of questions, if you answer, "Yes, I have stopped kicking the dog," well, that says you are been kicking the dog and you've been not too nice to Fido. And that's not a good way to look. If you say, "No, I have not stopped kicking the dog," well, that's even worse. In other words, we know that the way the question is phrased, "Have you stopped kicking the dog?" is phrased in such a way that to answer it in any way is to implicate yourself. What Jesus did in this passage was the equivalent of asking the religious leaders if they had stopped kicking the dog. Jesus put themselves in a position where they could not answer the question without incriminating themselves. Jesus, in this way, took the focus from himself to them. In the process of doing this, Jesus avoided the question that was directed to him. You see, what Jesus did was, instead of answering the question, it was shift everything back to the religious leaders, and the religious leaders have their little discussion as they huddle around, and Jesus does not have to answer their question. What Jesus understood was that the question was not ultimately about authority. Yes, it was about authority, but not exactly so. You see, the problem, and Jesus knew this, was that the religious leaders had already determined the answer. You see, they were not interested in what Jesus put his authority in as much as they respected as that he respected their authority. Go back to what we said in a previous reading. Understood in the Roman Empire that there was as it were, a chain of order. The Romans ruled the empire, and one of the ways that they ruled the empire was by providing or giving authority to underlings. They would go into an area, think of a city like Jerusalem, and what they would do is they would rule there. But they knew that they were not in a position, as it were, to rule directly. So what they did was allow people to rule under their authority. They were quite willing to give those people authority in exchange for recognizing their authority. In a sense, the Roman system very much operated in this way throughout society, where there was this chain of authority. And so, what the religious leaders were doing, now understand that there's a side of what they were doing, which was not particularly nefarious, but was operating out of the cultural values of the day. They gained authority from Rome. They had authority from Rome. And they were saying to Jesus, as long as you recognize and respect my authority, we will allow you to have a measure of authority. But you have to respect our authority as we in turn respect Roman authority. And so what Jesus was doing was, in essence, not playing the game by the rules as it was written. You see, the Romans had ultimate authority, but allowed local elites like the temple rulers to have a sense of authority. These local elites had power and position and a vested interest in Roman rule. This was the framework that the religious leaders worked from. They had authority from above and were willing to allow Jesus to have a measure of authority as long as he recognized their authority. Now, let's apply this to the church in any given day and age. The church has its authority and thus its mandate from Jesus Christ, who rose on the first day of the week. The authority of the church is in the risen Lord. The church does not necessarily operate under that authority. What am I saying? The institutional church does not necessarily operate under the authority of the risen Lord. Now take a typical technique in a totalitarian country. What totalitarian countries do is realize that, you know what, in terms of public image, especially in the greater world, it is far better to have the church in our midst than not. Because then they can say we are open to other ideas and open to other ways of doing things. But you know what the totalitarian governments do is say, you can have your church, but you have to recognize our authority. As long as you recognize us as authoritative, we will allow you to have your services, we will allow you to have your buildings, and we will allow you to have your church. But you see, the church cannot exist unless Jesus Christ is what? Accepted as the risen Lord and as the ultimate authority. Whether it is the Roman authorities of Jesus' day or the totalitarian regimes of today, it doesn't matter. Authority for the Christian is Jesus Christ as Lord. And you see, if we operate as a church in a jurisdiction where we are subservient to the ruling authorities, then we have gutted the church of what it is to be about. To outward eyes, the church may look like the church, but inwardly it is gutted. You see, in those situations, it's far better for governments to have the church exist under its authority than not to exist, because at least it is under their control. But if it becomes a house church with no recognition of the government as authoritative over the church, the society, the government is concerned. The danger in all places around the world is that the church is content to name the name of Jesus and not live under and embrace the authority of the risen Christ. The church is only the church when Jesus Christ, the risen Son of God, is enthroned as the Lord over